I request MP Joseph sir for the keynote address.
Honorable Metrachan, respected Matthew Koshisa, and all the distinguished friends. I am indeed happy to be part of this conversation, to identify faith imperatives in our struggles to maintain the integrity of God's creation. The profound words of Metrachan has set us into a good perspective of where we should be moving into. And let me also express my profound gratitude to Professor Matthew Koshisa for this kind invitation and also for his prophetic leadership to create a public consciousness on ecological issues. We are in a kairotic moment. The warnings of the impending tipping point at 1.5 degrees Celsius has not made any convincing impact on the leaders of the powerful nations who gathered in Glasgow. After making few empty pronouncements, they returned to their assigned role of serving the capital and to ensure that capital will continue to grow at any cost. Glasgow meeting once again proved that the political leadership is incapable of bringing any radical changes in the economic and social structure that leads to a convivial relationship between people and nature. Therefore, we are reminded again of the urgency to organize various sectors of people's movements to identify different means of intervention in order to save life and also to save Earth. I do hope that the initiatives of this nature that the Church has promoted under the leadership of Matthew Koshisa will be instrumental for the growth of various people's initiatives. Let me make few introductory remarks. Since students are attending this seminar, I would like to start with a confession, a very sincere confession. The people who are responsible for killing the earth are the people of my generation and my parents' and grandparents' generation. We totally failed to understand the meaning of life and therefore constructed erroneous logic to organize our individual and collective life. As we often argue, humans are always in search of two things. First, happiness, and second, identity. But we wrongly identified that prosperity is the foundation for happiness, and proximity to and consumption of material realities offer us an identity. This wrong notion suggested that people have no social subjectivity as such. Only certain commodities do have social subjectivity. Therefore, by consuming those commodities with social subjectivity, people do gain identity. And to gain identity and happiness, therefore, we constructed a growth-oriented economic structure. We measured all activities on the scale of growth. Of course, the only medium for us to measure growth was money. But later, money moved from the medium to the storehouse of value. Even our own value as individuals, value of our occupation, and value of all realities around us were evaluated and stored under money. Unending exploitation of nature and fellow human beings is legitimized and promoted under this logic. To promote growth and efficiency, we created an educational system with the cornerstone of competition. Competition helped us to see the other as our adversary with whom we do not share any common concern. We introduced the concept of success, which essentially is a celebration of the weakness of our neighbor. We considered Newtonian science as the primary means to understand nature and to relate with nature. We created technologies to serve capital, not life. In the cultural realm, we hailed modernity and accepted the definitions given by people like W. Rustow, who suggested that living with nature is primitive and our distance from nature makes us modern. If we walk barefoot, we are primitives, and if we wear socks and shoes, we are closer to modernity. We also created a spirituality that was built on the desacralization of nature. Our spirituality was built on our economic interest. I could go on with this list. This list could include politics, social structures, gender, and many more. What I have to say that our generation failed miserably. We failed miserably to offer you a future. My plea, therefore, to my young children is that please do not follow this failed logic, that of your parents, grandparents, and teachers. This logic has totally failed. So please reject this logic of your parents and teachers and construct new logic that helps to construct a life-giving structure. New logic in economics, politics, religion, and all other areas of life. This is my earnest plea and a confession. My second comment, that I am not a student of Bible, and my knowledge in biblical language and literature are very limited. Therefore, I have no ability or wisdom to make a scholarly presentation acceptable to biblical scholars who are present in this seminar. I will rather depend on secondary materials to understand this complex literature in the book of Revelation. Third, one of the key contributions of Henrik Dussel, a historian, is a concept of analytic or anadialectic. Dussel transcends the traditional notion of dialectics proposed by Hegel and later developed by Heidegger, where Hegel and Heidegger primarily operates within the totality of the dominant systems. In Dussel's new paradigm of analytic, he uses the term ana, meaning beyond, to refer to people who are outside the totality, people who rejects the totality and on the same time counterpose an alternative, an utopian horizon, drawing from their painful experience of oppression. Nevertheless, informed by the rich cultural heritages of the excluded people in the earth. This observation is pertinent in the study of the book of Revelation. Since the text evolved among the margins as a critique of totality created by the empire. As Weiss Daniels observed, the book of Revelation is a letter written by someone imprisoned by the Roman state to early Christian communities who are predominantly at that point living under Roman occupation. The letter is to explain how to survive and resist, how to not become like the empire. During this period of John, the Hellenistic cities of Roman Empire had ecclesia or citizens' assemblies organized under the patronage of the empire. And as an alternative, the followers of Jesus formed also assemblies, ecclesias. But John perceived a threat to that is visiting the alternate communities of Jesus, because some of the influential members within the Jesus communities were increasingly being attracted to the ways of the empire. All but 2 of the communities addressed in the letter were guilty of collusion with Rome. To all the 7 churches, John warned them of the true character of the empire. Empire, as John describes, has 2 characteristics. One, it appeals as a seductive prostitute, offering good life in exchange for conformity. But on the other hand, it's a beast devouring those who would oppose it. It was therefore the task of the communities to resist the empire by embracing God's alternative way. Reading of Revelation in our time, therefore, should help us to identify the deceptive means through which the empire assimilates us into its agendas. The 4th introductory remarks is about hermeneutics as a whole. The traditional reading of the Bible is often known as semantic positivism. Semantic positivism aims at gaining control of the meaning of the printed text, catalog them, and draw them out selectively when needed. The semantic positivism is the result of a textual positivism, where the text is deified. The text it assumes that the text offers answers to all issues of life, since it appeared as the only source that represents metaphysical truth. This form of deification of the printed text leads to religious dogmatism and takes away the meaning and dynamism of a living word. Reading of Revelations as descriptions of end-time predictions, rapture, war, and so on during the Gulf War has demonstrated how religious dogmatism manipulated reading of the text to legitimize their political and social interests. But the purpose of the reading of the Bible is not to interpret the ancient text, but to interpret our own life, with the help of the text. The reading should lead to a progressive discovery of our life and context. As late Bishop Paulus Mar Gregorios has reminded us, reading of Bible should help us to discern how we perceive reality and how could we improve or reconstruct the prevailing understanding of the realities. That means we need to make a distinction between the written text and the Bible of life. Bible of life is the identification and discernment of the presence and practice of the incarnate word in our life. Life is the location where God life is the location where word of God speaks. Wes Daniels, a very beautiful book that was published a few years ago, therefore reminds that while reading the book of Revelation, we should stop asking, what does it mean? And instead, we should start asking, how do we live into this vision? The central theological inquiry of the book of Revelation, as Elizabeth Ferenza reminds, is the question of to whom does the earth belongs? Who is the ruler of this world? And the central theological symbol, therefore, is the throne. Who occupies the throne? The liberating divine or the death-dealing demonic power? John wrote the Revelations during the height of imperial prosperity in Asia Minor, but had the prophetic courage to proclaim that even under this growth of prosperity, the unjust rule of Rome is coming to an end. The victory of the slaughtered lamb is already a reality that the churches need to experience. The book of Revelation is often identified with the genre of ancient apocalyptic writings. Apocalypse literally means revealing or pulling back a curtain. Apocalyptic writings often employ a popular type of literature to communicate a message, not based on any logical proof or arguments, but by offering visionary journeys with an aim of creating an alternate worldview. As Chet Myers reminds, apocalyptic literature in the Bible was not about predicting God's shattering destruction of the world. Instead, it was a symbolic discourse of resistance, which arose first during Persian, then Hellenistic, then Roman domination, which brought profound changes to the traditional life. Powerful elites ruled more cruelly, extracted resources more thoroughly, imposed slavery more widely, and fought unending wars more mercilessly. All of this made life more miserably for peasants and those in the margins. Apocalyptic vision is an expression of people's urge to end the system of oppression. After all, as Chet Myers says, for the poor, the end of the world is already and forever being visited upon their communities by soldiers, by fortune hunters, and by the police. The art of imagination employed by these writings is to reinforce a sense of urgency and the call to faithful, renewed commitment and immediate action. John's vision was not informed by any metaphysical dualism between the material world and the spiritual world, but was informed by the empirical realities that the early communities faced under the Roman occupation. There are parallels in the history of the marginalized communities around the world of using such kind of imagination to resist colonial and hegemonic regimes. In the apocalyptic vision narrated in chapter 4 and 5, John travels to heaven and sees a challenging vision of the throne, the true regulating power behind the universe. Angels and animals are singing songs of praise to the slaughtered lamb. The later visions unveil the nature of Rome, a demonic beast that oppresses people, land, animals, and water. God's people, therefore, must move away from the empire. Like the Exodus events, the plague will visit the empire and will destroy those who are destroying the earth. The second genre of Revelation literature is classified as prophetic. As Barbara Rosings observed, like other biblical prophets, John's primary purpose in writing prophecy was not to predict future events, but rather to wake up people to discern the plight of their present situation. Abraham Joshua Heschel, a very celebrated Hebrew scholar, he reminds that Hebrew prophets were people who were grammatically mad. They spoke of the present in future tense, and they never followed grammar, but spoke about the present in future tense. They had the vision of what ought to be and demonstrated an uncompromising urgency to realize the vision of the future in the present. This is what we find in Jesus as well. When Jesus said that kingdom of God is an immediate reality, he was alluding to this prophetic tradition or speaking of the present in future tense. In John's view, God's empire on earth cannot cohabit with any dehumanizing power that destroy the earth and people. The Lamb defeated Babylon, the two beasts and the dragon. And chapter 12, 21 and 22 proclaim victory over the forces of death. That means faithful to God calls for uncompromising resistance towards the empire and its wicked ways. It is significant that the new earth is an earth free from all life-destroying and oppressive forces. This is the chapter that respected Patrachan has read to us. God's liberation includes the total liberation of earth and its inhabitants. In the time when Revelation was written, emperor cult or the worship of Roman emperors as gods was a vibrant tradition. Roman emperors were called as Augustus, meaning venerable or reverend, has a religious meaning. And they have also created, by using this term Augustus, they also have created a path for erecting temples and shrines where the people offered sacrifices to honor the emperors as gods. One of the examples of the emperor cult in the context of the book of Revelation is the temple complex dedicated to Augustus and his descendants. The temple complex has statues of day and ocean, night and earth, along with representative figures of ethnic groups, islands, and geographical areas that Augustus has conquered. The temple reified the notion that Augustus had subdued the earth, the animals, the waters, and peoples. The imperial ideology suggested that peace and salvation comes through the blessings of emperor. Revelation thus is a battle of imagination. A battle of imagination between the emperor cult and the followers of the Lamb which was slaughtered. Revelation chapter 7, 9 to 17 describes a great multitude, so large it could not be counted. Assemblies, and they assembled around the throne. They cry out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who is seated on the throne, and to the Lamb." The text goes on to describe that safety, security, guidance, and sustenance will come from God and the Lamb. Such claims directly are challenges of the propaganda of Rome's emperor cult. John also brings nature as a subject in opposition to the empire. As Chet Myers reminds, it is not uncommon in the biblical literature that nature struggled against the evil powers of the empire. That is the story of the plague in the Exodus narrative. Starting with the river Nile turning its water to blood, the nature fought along with the slaves for liberation. And even in the journey of the slaves from Egypt to freedom, the powers of nature accompanied them as pillars of fire and clouds. As we said earlier, the ancient texts are not to be examined with mathematical rationality. They are battles of myths. They are battles of different worldviews with imagination. By revisiting the plague narratives, the writer of Revelation reminds that the struggles of the first century Christians are not different from the struggles of the slaves under Pharaoh. And as God stood with the slaves against the mighty power of the empire, The slaughtered lamb will ensure liberation of the oppressed communities under the Roman domination. Secondly, it is also reminding that nature is also a subject oppressed and destroyed by the imperial power and is seeking liberation from it. In the book of Revelation, nature rebelled against the claims of Rome, of its domination over the earth, the animals, and the sea. The domination over the land, animals, and sea had profound environmental ramifications. Micah D. Keel offers a detailed account of the plight of these three subjects of creation. Roman economy was built on slave labor and also on the conquest of other nations. War was not just a political issue, but war was an economic activity. Probably it is true in the present time as well. Slave labor was used for extensive mining of war machinery and for acquiring precious metal. Pliny the Elder, writing in AD 79, describes the plight of an exhausted mine that was deliberately caved in the miners' gaze as conquerors upon the collapse of nature. Mining operations often impacted water sources. For example, this writer who writes in AD 79 observed that the diversion and channeling of water to places where the miners needed for its works had destroyed the natural geography. Poisonous elements such as lead, mercury, and arsenics polluted waterways, and these activities polluted the air. The destruction of land was made possible through the brutal exploitation and violence against the labor, mostly the slave labor. According to Pliny's account, the miners do not see the daylight for many months, and it is comparatively safer to get pearls from the depths of the sea because mining was so much more dangerous at that time. Processing of raw materials required enormous amount of wood, which resulted in massive deforestation. At the same time, ancient technology with fewer implements limited the depth a mine could reach. So the mines were often quickly exhausted. And this shortcoming encouraged the empire to look new mining areas in distant lands and also for new forest areas for firewood. The thirst for goods of the earth pushed the Romans to expand their territory, perhaps beyond what they could sustain. Chapter 9 of Revelation describes the pain of the land in apocalyptic language. A star falls to the earth, opening a pit that smokes like a furnace. The angel opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth. A second category that Revelation emphasizes of the control of empire is the domestic animals and the wild animals. Violence was a means of entertainment in the Roman Empire. Gladiators fought and died in front of the rich to make them laugh. Along with the violent fights of the gladiators, Rome was famous for the fights involving animals. All types of beasts were brought to the fighting rings, And the animals were pitted against the other animals and also against human gladiators. This animal sport destroyed huge number of animals since the festival lasted for almost an entire year. The killing of so many animals devastated the animal populations in the ancient world. The animal sport had significant symbolic value for the Romans. They demonstrated concretely the power of the emperor and the wealth of those who supported such games. For example, killing of a lion in the center of Rome was considered as a mark of the total power of the emperor over the universe, or even as a social statement to declare that Rome controlled nature and also the world. Revelation 5 begins with a vision of a scroll with 7 seals in the right hand of the one seated on the throne. John weeps because no one is able to open the scroll until he realizes that the Lamb is worthy to open. This leads to a vision of many thousands of angels, along with the elders and 4 living creatures who sing with full voice of how the Lamb is worthy. Then the song to the Lamb expands to include every creature in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them. This language evokes the creation story in Genesis 1. By specifically naming those creatures on the earth, under the earth, and in the sea, the author captures all of creation, not just humans, as those who acknowledge the autonomy of God on the throne and of the Lamb. To a community familiar with the treatment of animal by the empire, songs of praise by the animals alludes to the cardinal theological statement that God alone is the creator of the universe, creator and protector of all, including the animals. Using many texts from the Old Testament, John praises God for creating all things. In chapter 4, 24 elders around God's throne sing, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." These creatures like lion, ox, eagle, and human seem to be representatives of the world of earthly creatures that hung around the throne in John's vision. John's depiction of the heavenly realm certainly is non-anthropocentric. The human has no privilege or precedence here. This non-anthropocentric vision of heaven was a dramatic counter ideology with deep political ramifications. It negates Roman claim of domination and power over the animals. The third reality that Rome established domination is sea, is water. John ends his vision with the grand narrative of the new heaven and new earth. A courageous political statement expressing the unbeatable hope that the present rule will not last. Roman domination and its death-leading method of rule will be replaced by a new earth. But for John, in the new earth, the sea was no more. Sea is a recurring theme in the book of Revelation and made references at least 26 times, much more than any other book in the New Testament. In a peripheral reading, it may appear that John hated the sea. But the vision of the life-affirming new earth has in its center the river of life, bright as crystal, that flows from the throne of God to the middle of the city, giving life to everything that it touches. Perhaps John's interpretation of the sea are dependent upon the context in which he lived. First, the influence of the Jewish creation mythology, which depict the sea as the origin of chaos and an adversary of God. The oldest creation story in the ancient Near East, one that the Jewish people shared with their neighbors, describes a God who creates by destroying a mythological sea monster. This myth is much older than the ordered creation story that we find in Genesis 1. In Psalm 74, for instance, the writer of Psalm understands creation as a primordial battle. Let me quote, God working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. But the book of Daniel narrates that the beast of the sea reappears. It's not been killed in the initial creation story in Genesis, but it reappears. Let me quote from Daniel chapter 7. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by the night 4 winds of heaven string up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea. Because of this reappearance of the appearance of the monster, the sea need to be crushed. Secondly, John uses the sea as a reference to the economic and militaristic power of the Roman Empire. In chapter 17, John sees a vision of a prostitute who rides on the beast. She is seated on many waters. References later in the chapter makes it clear that this woman represents Rome, and her placement on the water indicates one source of Rome's power and wealth. Chapter 18 reinforces this idea, expressed as a lament by those rich and powerful individuals who will be impoverished by Rome's downfall at the hands of God. In chapter 18, we read this lament. The merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewel, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, all kinds of wood, all articles of ivory, all articles of bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, and the list goes on and on. As George Zachariah has noted, last week we heard from Dr. Peniel, quoting George, in the unjust imperial economy of Rome, everyone who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For Babylon, sea was one of the primary agents for exercising its might and power to invade, plunder, destroy, and enslave communities and nature in the colonies. The specific items listed above were among the greatest luxuries of the Roman world, and it was a demonstration of the consumeristic addictions of the rich at the expense of the people in the colonies. Moreover, the sea also provided the possibility of exploitation and evil hegemony of the empire. It reminds us an adversary of God. Rome, as the beast who is given authority from the devil, rises from the sea. It is Rome's domain, not God's domain. Therefore, the absence of sea in the apocalyptic vision of John depicts a total negation of the logic of imperial economy. Removing the sea removes the essential elements of element of the mechanism of Rome's exploitative consumerist economy. As a counter vision, Revelation presents the river of life, flowing from the throne of God. In the river of life, water is a free gift to all. To the one who is thirsty, I will give to drink from the spring of water of life as gift. Revelation 21:6. Let everyone who is thirsty come. Let everyone who wishes take the water of life as a gift. Revelation 22:17. Water is no more regulated by the logic of the imperial economy, but it is a source of life for all, a gift of God. The narrative in the book of Exodus, the bread falling from above to feed the hungry masses, almost reminds the same logic. First, the life-giving bread is a free gift from God. That's what it reminds. All the resources in the world are gifts, free gifts of God to all. And therefore, it is for the nourishment of all the people. Secondly, it reminds that resources are in the world for satisfying life, not for turning it into a commodity or for the accumulation that eventually transfigure as dominant power. The story of bread falling from heaven is also reminds the need of how we need to keep limits of consumption. Let no one leave any of it over until tomorrow. There is a limit of accumulation. Thirdly, this story also reminds that the disparities in wealth and power are not natural, but are the result of human sin. Let me quote from Exodus 16. But when they measured with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. Verse 18. This is the Sabbath economy, the manna economy. In Revelation, John also critiques inequality between rich and poor. He applauds the churches in the opening chapters for being poor and denigrates those that are materially rich. He mocks the economic structures of the Roman Empire and claims that the economy of the Roman Empire are created by Satan. Besides, Revelation's counter vision of water proposes that commodification of resources is a sin. And all forms of commodification of resources is a sin. The vision of Revelation also includes the tree of life. On either side of the river is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruits, producing its fruit each month, and leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. In the Genesis story of creation, the fruit from the tree of life was forbidden. Adam, the first human beings, were not allowed to eat this. But Revelation lifts this prohibition. Now everyone could eat from the tree of life. And the leaves of the trees have therapeutic function for the healing of the nations. The healing of the earth comes through the leaves of the trees, which is nourished by the river of the water of life. Revelation proclaims an alternate doctrine of salvation when it affirms the agency of the leaves and the water in the healing of the nations. The leaves and the waters participate in the divine mission of redemption in history. Besides, Revelation is clear that the healing is not for individuals, but God's healing is for the whole world. for all people as well as for the earth. Revelation is not to proclaim the destruction of the earth, but to lament over the fact that earth, water, and all its inhabitants are captives to Rome. In Barbara Rosing's words, the book of Revelation laments Rome's exploitation of the entire world, its enslavement of both humans and nature by violent military conquest. As Howard Brooks, who wrote a challenging commentary on the book of Revelation, elsewhere noted that Bible narrates a struggle between two competing religions, not Judaism and Christianity versus other religions, but religion of creation versus religion of empire. And he says that this is what we find throughout the Bible. And Hebrew scriptures offers a battle space to these two trajectories of the religions. And these are two radically divergent views of the religion of creation and the religion of empire. Other biblical scholars has talked about God, the two trajectories as the religions of the companion God and the religions of the temple. But for Brooks, it is religion of creation versus religion of empire. And he also argues that in the New Testament, Jesus proclaimed and embodied one of these two views, the religion of creation, and Jesus denounced specifically the religion of the empire. Though Jesus was killed by the upholders of empire, the resurrection story tells that God vindicated the religion of creation. And Brooks also gives an extensive account of what it means to be religion of the creation and religion of the empire. Because of time, I'm not engaging deeply, but look at certain things. Place of God's encounter all over the earth. But religion of empire, it's the urban temple mediated by the priest and elites. Basic social structure is in the religion of creation, egalitarian kinship, in empire, hierarchical patronage. Relationship to land in creation belongs to God. People are tenants, conviviality with the entire creation, while for religion of empire, private ownership of land, mediated through money and power. And he goes on to almost everything. Revelation is a battleground for this conflict. We should recall that Revelation has stated that there is no temple in the holy city. The river of life flows out not from the temple as in Ezekiel, but from the throne of the God and of the Lamb. The empire is a whole way of thinking, acting, and worshipping in the world. The book of Revelation offers an alternate vision, a community of worship formed around the self-giving love of Lamb that was slaughtered. Our challenge is to be that alternate community, the multitude that rejects the beastly economics of the empire and follow the Lamb that was slaughtered. Let me end. The central symbol in the book of Revelation is heaven, a highly contested concept. The celebrated Jewish theologian Hans Hucko was also working in the World Council of Churches for a while. He offered a very convincing explanation of what it means, what is the meaning of heaven in the Bible. Let me quote from him. The Jewish rabbis construed that two words were hidden in Shamayim, the Hebrew word for heaven. two words which are each other's absolute opposites. Ish meaning fire and Maim meaning water. Peace in heaven is then the living together in unity and communion of two opposites, fire and water. Water doesn't quench fire, and fire doesn't make the water evaporate. And these are, in human consciousness, these are the two perfect oppositions, fire and water. But fire, these perfect opposites, fire and water reconciled. That is what is heaven. One does not defeat the other. There is no separation between fire and water. There is a true and total reconciliation. When the Hebrew prophets explained the God's rule through different symbols, they alluded to this meaning of Shamayim, a total reconciliation of all realities. For example, Isaiah 11. Isaiah 11 offers a beautiful picture of how nature is reconciling with nature. All the beastly animals living with domestic animals by giving up its beastly nature and eating straw along with other animals. We found this vision in John as well, where four living creatures around the throne, the beastly lion, a grass-eating ox, a living creature with human face, and a flying eagle. This reconciliation between nature and nature, including humans, is the vision of Shamayim, holds in Isaiah chapter 11. But in Isaiah 65, possibly more direct references to the concept of Shamayim. In chapter 65, Isaiah tells that reconciliation is needed not only among animals and between animals and human beings, but also between living labor and the objectified labor. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruits. The economic system that we follow is to ensure that the fruits of labor will not stay with the producer. The fruits of labor will be objectified and appropriated by others. Our technologies, our economic logic, our science, everything is to ensure that the living labor has no control over the objectified labor. The forced alienation between labor and objectified labor is the root of capitalism. And this is the reality in which we live. The dominant ecological crisis avoids this vision of Isaiah and instead blames humanity as a whole for the crisis. Therefore, they invented very fancy terms like Anthropocene, anthropocentric, and other terms. These terms are deceptive terms. The people who are dying due to hunger has not contributed anything to destroy the nature. For example, residents of Ambani consumes around 640,000 units of power per month. And Anthropocene scientists pronounce that Ambanis and the families that use less than 50 units or not even a single unit of electricity are all equally responsible for the destruction of the ecosystems. Huge majority of the population in the world have no ability to destroy ecosystems. To destroy, one needs tools and power. Therefore, we need a new approach. Present discourse on alternatives is also based on these assumptions proposed by the same logic, thinking that the problem could be fixed by planting trees, changing light bulbs, or finding alternatives to fossil fuels. This fixing approach is to save the present logic of an exploitative economic order. And that is where we need to read the book of Revelation in a new light. John the political prisoner caged in the island of Patmos, was not satisfied with a small fix. He offers instead a clash of kingdoms, a kingdom of the world and the kingdoms of the slaughtered lamb. This is the choice we have. Either the rule of capital or the rule of love and justice. Thank you very much for listening this long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, MP Joseph sir, for delivering a scholarly lecture, giving more insights for us. I would like to give 10 minutes for asking questions, and if you have any comments, you can do it. A question from New Earth come to us, or we have been taken to New Earth.
As I said, I am not a student of Bible. The reading of the Revelation reminds me that the challenge for us is not wait for something coming from outside, but the renewal of the systems that functions against the life-giving offer by God. All that has been created is life-affirming realities around us. But we have transformed all these life-affirming realities into commodities and power. And that leads into death-dealing experiences for many. The challenge for us is therefore how we transform these death-dealing realities into life-affirming realities. And that is where the faith calls us at the present time.
There is another question. What do you mean by reconciliation between water and earth? Another question from Madurai Ramnad. Here, it is new insight towards ecological concerns, especially the new creation concept in Revelation. Thank you so much, Ayya. Raja CSI, Dice of Madurai Ramnad.
The emphasis of reconciliation that I said is reconciliation between nature and nature. Not the beastly animals satisfying their life by consuming the other, but the beastly animals giving up their beastly nature. That is what Isaiah 65, Isaiah 11, and Isaiah 65 alludes to. By giving up the beastly nature, it reconciles with other nature. But in Isaiah 65, all this reconciliation will take place. The foundation of all this reconciliation is a reconciliation among the human community, where the alienation between the living labor and objectified labor, what I call the objectified labor, is the fruits of labor. And that reconciliation between living labor and the objectified labor is the basis in which how we construct a new reconciled society. And that will lead also to the end of exploitation of nature and offer possibility for a convivial living with nature and animals. There is no more. If living labor is no more alienated from objectified labor, it also means that there is no need of an alienation between people and nature. There is no need for an exploitation of nature. We live among the limits that has been given by God.
Another question, do you think the Bible counter the empire always, or occasionally the Bible aligns with the empire?
What I quoted from Brooks about these two religious traditions, the religion of creation and the religion of the empire. That's part of the traditions of the Bible. I often talk in a different language, that in the Old Testament, what you find is two different trajectories. One, a pre-monarchic trajectory, a religion that emerged in the pre-monarchic Israel, and a religion that emerged after the monarchy came into power. Remember, the temple is a creation of the monarchy. Temple is created in order to justify the monarchic systems of rule that David and Solomon has instituted. Solomon was not a wise king, as we read in the Bible. His wisdom was based on his ability of reinstituting slavery in Israel. Maybe a footnote is needed. In the in the book of Revelation, evil is identified with the number 666. And the biblical scholars I have quite a lot of different interpretations about what this 666 represents. Majority of the scholars say that it is a representation of Nero, because the way in which how people identified names in the ancient world was by counting the letters. But if you look at the Bible, it's a very different kind of reminder. The first time the term 666 is used is to talk about the amount of tax that Solomon has collected. He collected 666 talents of gold every year as tax from the poor farmers. That itself shows the nature of exploitation that he has. So the difference in the Hebrew text is between these two trajectories. The God of the pre-monarchic Israel and the God concept of the monarchic Israel. The God of the pre-monarchic Israel was a companion God, a God who always moved with the people because there was no temple. The God who lived in tents with the people. And in that society, there was no private ownership. The land was owned by God, and people only had the right to cultivate in the land. But everything changed in the monarchic Israel, and this is what is central. And maybe you will find this in the New Testament also. This division between pre-monarchic understanding of God and the monarchic understanding of God, which has been carried on. Sorry for taking too much time.